The Palmer family's story begins in Wasilla, Alaska, a community of around 10,000 people nestled in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, known for its stunning natural beauty, but also its isolation and challenging terrain. The family, consisting of parents Chuck Sr. and Lisa Rierick, their daughter Hannah, and their three sons, Chris the eldest, Charles in the middle, and their youngest, Michael. They all loved the Alaskan wilderness and loved hiking, fishing, hunting, and snowmobiling, among other things that they do together. This setting would become the backdrop for two separate disappearances within the family over a span of 11 years. Michael Timothy Palmer's disappearance on the 4th of June in 1999 stands as one of Alaska's enduring unsolved disappearances. It's a case that highlights the danger posed by the state's terrain, coupled with the cold. Wasilla is a flourishing suburb about 43 miles north of Anchorage that offered a mix of small-town camaraderie and untamed backcountry in the late 1990s. With its network of dirt roads, dense spruce forests, and meandering rivers like the Little Susitna, known for swift currents and sudden drop-offs, the area was a playground for the local youth, but also where one wrong turn could lead to things going badly wrong. Michael was born on the 8th of January 1984, making him just 15 years old when he disappeared. He was affectionately called Mike by his friends and family, and he embodied the spirited, perhaps rebellious energy of teenage life. On the night of the 3rd of June 1999, he was wearing blue jeans, a black jacket, and Converse. He had opted to stay at a close friend's house in Wasilla. The night was mild for Alaska, with temperatures in the 50s Fahrenheit, or around 10 degrees Celsius, and a twilight that lasts much longer this far north, that prevented full darkness. Sometime after midnight, Michael and three friends, looking for something to do, decided to leave the house without being noticed. Their destination was a high school graduation party to the north of the Meadow Lake subdivision, potentially around here. They rode bikes, Michael on one he'd borrowed for the evening, and they pedalled through the late quiet streets together. The party took place at a private home in the Meadow Lake subdivision, where scattered residences and vacant lots surrounded the area. It attracted a group of local teenagers, marking the end of the school year. The event continued late into the night with music, conversations, and people drinking. Michael had a few drinks himself, but according to later accounts from attendees, he appeared alert and in good spirits, showing no signs of having had too many. The party started to wind down around 3 AM, and by 4 AM, with early daylight appearing, the group got ready to depart. They got on their bikes and began the long, dark ride back towards their starting point. They headed onto Pittman Road, a two-lane route bordered by dense boreal forest on one side and the Little Susitna River on the other. The river measured about 20 feet across at that location, with shallow sections in places that had currents that could pose risks. The return trip began with the four riding together and talking as they covered the first few miles. During the ride, Michael began to lag behind the group at some point and eventually dropped out of their sight. Recognizing that he had fallen behind, his friends stopped, looked back, and called to him a couple of times, but they did not get a response. Initially not worried, as Pittman Road connected to various shortcuts and side routes, they just assumed that he'd taken one. They continued to the park's highway and stopped at a 24-hour 7-Eleven parking lot for a brief rest and to buy snacks. There, under the store's lighting, they waited for 10 to 15 minutes while watching for Michael on the road. When Michael did not arrive at the store, his friends concluded that he must have altered course and cycled directly to his own home, instead of returning to the friend's house where he was supposed to be staying. This assumption led to their decision to continue home without him. This precise moment when Michael was lost to the sight of his friends marks the effective beginning of the disappearance. To be clear also, they never heard anything untoward. They didn't hear Michael shout or scream to insinuate that something had happened or that he'd fallen off his bike. The remaining three friends finished their break before going their separate ways, each believing that Michael had reached his destination. By approximately 4:30 AM, the area remained quiet except for light early traffic on the nearby highway. Before we go any further, if I could just ask you to like the video and hype it, then I would appreciate that very much. And please consider turning on notifications for the channel and subscribing if you haven't already. Despite what the friends believed, Michael did not return to his family's home in Wasilla in those early hours. His family did not hear from him in the morning, and his absence was not immediately recognised as an emergency. As the morning progressed into the afternoon, concern grew among his relatives as they still hadn't heard from him. It was at this point that his mother, Lisa Palmer, began to suspect that something was wrong. She first contacted the residence where Michael ostensibly spent the night, but then learned that he never arrived. Now at 3 p.m, around 11 hours after the group had last seen him, his mother, after gathering details about the evening's activities, called the Alaska State Troopers to report him missing. The report prompted an urgent search effort. Troopers canvassed the likely route, interviewed the friends who described the separation as essentially unremarkable, as again, they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Afterwards, local residents were made aware of what had happened as the information circulated rapidly in the close-knit community of Wasilla. In the vast and unforgiving terrain of rural Alaska, the rapid deployment of resources, including search dog teams and dive teams, is essential for locating an individual or securing highly perishable forensic evidence. Even though the 11-hour lapse was about the best that could have been done in this instance, without the other boys seriously backtracking and conducting their own makeshift search at the time, that's still a long time for someone to be left out battling the cold. Sometime shortly after Lisa had filed the report, evidence was discovered that very afternoon. Search teams discovered a bike that was believed to be the one that Michael was riding, submerged in the water and tangled in weeds on the riverbed near the intersection of Pittman Road and Silver Drive. Available reports indicate that members of Michael's family, including his oldest brother, Chris, expressed skepticism and didn't believe that was the bike that Michael had been riding. They just didn't believe that it was the right one and had the view that the search needed to expand. Some ideas suggested that the bike was an unrelated discard, and Mike's bike may have been removed from the scene by whoever might have stumbled upon him. Obviously, if this bike was actually his, the natural conclusion leads towards an accident. The river at that location was clear, allowing visibility to the bottom from the shore, but the preliminary search turned up nothing. No clothing or any other items. Divers conducted multiple searches in the area over the following days, checking currents and potential catch points, but no further evidence was located. Adding to the investigation's complexity was the second piece of evidence that was discovered. This was still in close proximity to the river, yet under vastly different circumstances. Michael's shoes, identified by their size and brand matching the pair he wore that night, were located approximately 200 yards away from the river. The condition and placement of the footwear is central to the story, and just how unusual it was. The shoes were a pair of wet and silty Converse high tops, confirming that Michael, or at least the shoes themselves, had recently made contact with the river or the muddy riverbank. However, rather than being scattered or seemingly lost in a struggle, they were discovered placed neatly together in the middle of a private airstrip. The airstrip was a brief, grass-bordered runway for small aircraft operated by bush pilots, and it adjoined the riverbank. The airstrip saw periodic flights by residents travelling to Anchorage. They showed no indication of a struggle, only exposure to the overnight moisture. The contrasting evidence of the abandoned bike and then the seemingly deliberately organised shoes 200 yards away created a situation that was difficult to follow. In forensic analysis, the structured placement of personal items often signals intentional behaviour. If Michael did fall into the river, then I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but this supposed fall, followed by a long 200-yard walk, then neatly placing the footwear on the airstrip, isn't exactly a standard scenario. Such a situation would be closer to advanced hypothermia and paradoxical undressing, which would check out if he'd fallen into cold water and managed to get out. Though even then, I can't imagine that they'd have been left in such an organised manner. Alternatively, the placement could suggest that the scene was manipulated by some not known third party who was responsible for the disappearance. Whatever the case may be, search efforts intensified quickly. More than 50 volunteers, including troopers, firefighters, and local residents, systematically searched a 2-mile radius of the forest and undergrowth along the river, clearing through dense vegetation and checking beneath downed trees. They employed ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors to look for any concealed items, while helicopters conducted aerial surveys using thermal imaging equipment. K9 units were also deployed and were placed at the river, but they could not find a scent anywhere. So, even if that definitely was the bike that Michael had been riding, as the authorities believed, as per the dogs, I suppose it could mean that he wasn't the one that rode it into the river. Again, hypothermia is certainly a huge risk in these waters, and it was considered a possible factor, but also could not be confirmed. And also, as pointed out, abandoning items in such a way that Michael supposedly did isn't really a characteristic of paradoxical undressing. At these stages of hypothermia, there's not a lot of clear thinking going on. A person is very dazed, confused, groggy, slow-moving, and any abandoned equipment in that situation is usually just scattered on the ground over an area. Items are generally not seemingly deliberately placed. As the month of June progressed, the investigation expanded in response to numerous public tips. More than 24 in the initial month submitted by concerned residents, but these leads did not yield results. Michael's oldest brother, Chris, reported hearing accounts of altercations at the graduation party and expressed his belief that an adverse incident involving his brother took place there. Michael's father, questioning the consistency of the friend's accounts, hired private investigators. Many secondary accounts suggest that the first, a local with connections to police, withdrew after receiving anonymous phone threats advising her to cease involvement, leading her to move away from Wasilla. I'm not sure if that's true though. The subsequent investigator, who pursued leads more persistently, interviewed attendees informally and gathered reports of disputes. One account indicated Michael may not have left the party at 4 AM, suggesting he remained, encountered someone, and faced an incident prior to reaching the road. By late summer, a notable false lead surfaced. A young Wasilla resident, similar in age to Michael, contacted troopers with an account of hiding under a bridge over the river and observing someone he couldn't identify have an altercation with Michael that led to Michael being pushed into the water. This person would later go on to admit that the account was fabricated for attention, essentially. Repeated interviews with the three friends, including polygraph tests, remained consistent and didn't suggest that they'd lied about anything. Police analysis of the circumstances favoured an accident, such as veering off the road and into the river, though Michael's family didn't agree with that assessment. I can absolutely see why they did not agree with that. Firstly, Michael's body was never found, but even more prominent than that were the fact that his shoes were so deliberately placed on the airstrip. It's difficult to envision a situation in which Michael himself placed them there. Even if one were to agree with the assessment that he suffered from hypothermia and then abandoned them where he did, he would be very unlikely to have gotten very far from that point after doing so. So if Michael wasn't responsible for the shoes, then what's left? Either he really did fall into the water, and to confuse the entire situation, someone else placed them there for reasons that we don't understand. Or something untoward happened to Michael, and this responsible third party then set them there. I can certainly see how the orderly arrangement of the shoes challenged the straightforward conclusion that this was nothing more than an accident. There were efforts to revive interest in the case in 2000 and 2005, but they did not produce any results. As of now, Michael's body has never been found, and aside from the shoes, no further discoveries have ever been made. Despite that, that's not exactly where this story ends. In a completely bizarre coincidence that drew a lot of attention, Michael's case was compounded years later by the disappearance of his older brother, Charles Edwin Palmer, during a snowmobiling trip in Alaska's Talkeetna Mountains on the 10th of April in 2010. Charles, a 30-year-old resident of Wasilla, known as Chucky to friends and family, was an outdoors enthusiast. Later analyses of the event revealed two critical factors that contributed to his disappearance. Simply put, rider proficiency and preparedness. From what I can gather, while Charles did have a lot of skills and experience in the outdoors, he was not an experienced snow machine rider yet. Compounding this, in perhaps already difficult conditions, was the lack of safety equipment. On this outing, he hadn't taken a survival kit, a GPS, water, or emergency food. The Talkeetna Mountains in south-central Alaska consist of rugged ridges, valleys formed by glaciers, and areas prone to avalanches, where snowmobiling serves as a popular but potentially dangerous activity for those who are not properly prepared. In early April, the area retains winter conditions, with daytime melting followed by cold nights and possible storms that can cover paths with fresh snow. Charles' group, made up of his older brother Chris, their stepfather and 2 friends, chose this location for its proximity to Mastodon Road, a gravel route through the foothills that provides access to isolated cabins, such as the one near Sheep Creek where they were staying. The outing started as normal for Charles and the group, who reached the Bald Mountain area west of Mastodon Road during the early afternoon of Saturday the 10th of April 2010. They left their vehicles along the road, which is a typical starting point for such excursions, and prepared their snowmobiles for the journey to the cabin. Chris typically positioned himself as the last rider in the group to ensure that no one was left behind. But on this day, he was unable to join the group due to a snapped handlebar in his snowmobile that morning. So without Chris, the others departed with the stepfather at the front, and Charles, who was not an experienced rider, trailing at the rear on a snowmobile that he'd only recently purchased. The group proceeded to explore the trails during the afternoon, taking in the clear weather and scenery, having no reason to anticipate that a navigation error would lead to one member becoming separated. As darkness approached, the group opted to return to the cabin for the evening, as visibility was decreasing. Notably, in addition to not bringing a GPS, he also didn't bring anything to provide shelter. In a region without phone coverage, and where nighttime temperatures drop below freezing, these items are often advised to mitigate risks. Around 7:15 PM, while the group travelled along the primary trail towards the cabin, Charles lagged behind. Statements from the others indicated he must have accidentally turned onto a branching path that took him away from the main route. This change in direction, likely due to unfamiliarity with the area and the darkness that prevented him from seeing the others, directed him into a less travelled area several miles from the cabin. The Talkeetna backcountry features undulating terrain and hidden hazards, with recent snowmelt creating soft, deep accumulations that can immobilise vehicles. Charles' snowmobile became stuck in such an area, stopping several miles from the correct path. The group realised that Charles wasn't with them upon reaching the cabin, and initially assumed it resulted from a mechanical delay or a minor detour. As time passed without his arrival, everyone began to worry. The area was very remote, and at some point would have been completely pitch black. Charles, now potentially proceeding on foot in freezing temperatures, would have obviously been at risk of hypothermia, which, as we know, can lead to disorientation, fatigue, and loss of consciousness if not dealt with quickly. By the morning of Sunday, the 11th of April, approximately 12 hours after he was last seen, the group were able to make their way to notify the authorities. An initial search was organised, but adverse weather conditions, including overcast skies, strong winds, and new snow, prevented aerial operations and restricted ground efforts to searching near the cabin. Troopers focused on the main trail, considering possibilities such as a return loop or movement to elevated areas for better visibility. Since it appeared as though he'd just gotten lost, it seems reasonable to suggest that he might have tried to get some height in order to figure out where he was and where the cabin was. No evidence was found right away, and the delay in reporting him missing, which often in isolated areas can't be helped, was very unfortunate in this instance because it meant that any tracks that Charles might have left would have essentially just been covered by fresh snow. That afternoon though, search teams did discover and were able to recover Charles' snowmobile around 12 miles from the cabin near Sheep River, lodged in deep snow along the side trail. That is quite a long way for everyone to have been riding without realising that Charles was missing. Though if things were getting particularly dark at the time, they just can't have noticed over the sounds of their engines. Charles' snowmobile hadn't sustained any damage from an impact or anything else. Its path ended in a soft area of snow, implying that after it got stuck, he had to leave it there and continue on foot. No footprints were found extending from the site, and there were no impressions in the snow, nor any abandoned items anywhere to be found. This lack of evidence raised some questions. Specifically, the search leaders were trying to determine whether he had moved into the surrounding wilderness while disoriented. It is known that these deep snow areas can obscure any tracks within a very short period of time. Search activities expanded the day afterwards, with more than 40 volunteers assisting troopers, including personnel from Alaskan Mountain Rescue. A small plane and helicopter conducted overhead surveys around the snowmobile using thermal imaging cameras. Ground personnel on their own snowmobiles searched in a grid formation, examining the valleys and slopes within a 10-mile radius. On the 13th of April, search operations continued, with even more resources being poured into it. A helicopter delivered a search dog team who were hoping that their dogs could break the deadlock. The dogs, which were specialised in latching onto human scents, covered an area that was around half a mile, but they only responded to lingering traces at the snowmobile itself. 11 more snowmobile operators checked the outer trails, while volunteers searched lower elevations on foot. That day saw up to 6 inches of wet snow accumulation, which was almost guaranteed to conceal any potential evidence. The aircraft, delayed by ice on its components at the Wasilla base, completed only one flight over Bald Mountain later in the afternoon. By the 14th of April, fatigue and operational constraints led to a suspension of the ground search after 5 days, though authorities stated it was not a permanent suspension. Aerial searches continued intermittently under improved conditions. Through June, more flights examined areas that were exposed by melting snow, in hopes of locating items or remains. However, nothing was found. There were no pieces of clothing and no signs of animal predation. Reports frequently mentioned high winds as a likely factor in pushing snow around to bury any evidence. Michael and Charles' older brother, Chris, 32 at the time of Charles' disappearance, participated in the search for his brother over the 4 days, using a snowmobile to cover the Bald Mountain foothills alongside other volunteers. At points, the effort evoked memories of searching Wasilla's rural roads 11 years earlier for the brother, Michael. He said, "I never thought I'd have to deal with this again. 2 brothers aren't supposed to go missing from the same family." Without locating Charles, attention turned to formal resolution. In April 2011, 1 year after the incident, an Alaskan court officially declared that Charles had likely passed away due to natural causes in the freezing cold conditions. Despite the warm clothing, without shelter, a healthy individual will still be overcome by hypothermia at some point, which would have been worsened by lack of hydration and food, which you're supposed to have more of as is in the cold. As of 2025, the investigation remains open but inactive, with occasional reviews prompted by new information or routine checks. Explanations lead towards accidental outcomes, becoming lost and succumbing to the elements. Unlike Michael those years prior, this time there were no indications or suspicions of foul play. The disappearance of the brothers hold a few similarities that people have found interesting over the years. Both cases occurred in the south-central region near Wasilla, with Michael separating from his friends and then vanishing during a late-night bike ride home from the party, and later Charles becoming separated from his group on a snowmobiling excursion in the mountains. In each instance, they both lagged behind their groups, Michael possibly due to fatigue or something else, and Charles seemingly after things got dark, veered onto a side trail, becoming hopelessly lost 12 miles away from the cabin. There were no obvious tracks or footprints evident in either case, despite thorough searches. Extensive efforts involving troopers, volunteers, divers, canines and aerial support failed to locate either brother. The Palmer family have unfortunately not been able to have much in the way of closure in either case. As of the current time, neither brother has been found and their cases remain open. On that note, that brings us to the end of this. Please do remember to subscribe and turn on notifications for the channel. And also to like the video and hype it if you can, I'd be very grateful. Or a dislike if you disliked it. I'd just like to thank you for watching, and a really big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. Be safe all, peace.